Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Information Week webinar, Developing an Effective Cloud Security Strategy for Today's IT Enterprise, sponsored by Red Seal and broadcast by Informa. I'm Jessica Davis with Information Week, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and participate in the question and answer session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we will ask you to provide feedback via the survey widget found at the bottom of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. And lastly, if you are experiencing any technical problems, please click the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen. Or you can type your issue into the Q&A area, and we will be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. Now, on to the presentation, Developing an Effective Cloud Security Strategy for Today's IT Enterprise. Discussing today's topic are our two speakers. First, we have Anil Carmel, co-founder and CEO of C2 Labs. Anil is the co-founder and CEO of C2 Labs, which delivers freedom from paper via our elasticity, continuous compliance automation software, and DevSecOps services. He previously served as the National Nuclear Security Administration Deputy Chief Technology Officer. He's also been in the IT industry for over 20 years, working with Fortune 500 companies and governments in the areas of cloud, cybersecurity, and data-driven IT strategic planning. He and his team garnered industry and government accolades, including the SANS National Cybersecurity Innovators Award for Cloud Security, Information Week 500 Top Government IT Innovators, ACT IAC Excellence.gov Award, and the DOE Secretary's Achievement Award. And we also have Dr. Mike Lloyd, Chief Technology Officer of Red Seal, joining us today. He has more than 25 years of experience in the modeling and control of fast-moving complex systems. He's been granted 21 patents on security, network assessment, and dynamic network control. Before joining Red Seal, he was the Chief Technology Officer at Route Science Technologies, which was acquired by Avaya, where he pioneered self-optimizing networks. He's also served as the principal architect at Cisco on the technology used to overlay MPLS VPN services across service provider backbones. He joined Cisco through the acquisition of NetSys Technologies, where he was a senior network modeling engineer. So excited to welcome these speakers today. And Anil and Mike, over to you.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Jessica. And I will echo Jessica's welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Happy to be here and honored to talk to you all and share some thoughts around how you all can develop an effective cloud security strategy for your organization. So what I'd like to do is actually start off with a story. You know, when you wake up in the morning, what's typically the first thing that you reach for? Most people reach for their glasses. Most people probably reach for their cell phone. And they grab their phone, no matter what time it is. It says 10 p.m., but it'd be, 6 a.m. And what's the first application that you typically tend to open? Typically some folks will, think about email maybe, or calendar to see what their meeting schedule looks like. But a lot of folks tend to open up for social media because the best posts come in between 12 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. So anyway, you open up your social media, you check your email, you check your calendar, you feel all kinds of productive, you get ready for your day, right? And you get in your car and you drive on your way to work. And by the way, you were so productive in the morning in your LinkedIn. You had several people that reached out to you. You accepted requests. So you got so much done before you even left the house. And you figured, well, on the way to work, why don't I stop and get myself a latte from the favorite coffee shop just down the street from the office. So you go in, and the barista made you a beautiful latte, and you just had to take a picture and upload it to your social media platform of choice, and check in and show that you're there, and head on into the office, and you feel all kinds of productive. So you walk into the office, you sit down, you plug in your laptop, and you realize, your phone, because you've been so productive for these last several hours, is actually a little low on power. So you just go in and plug it into your laptop to get some power going, and you get on with your day. And about 20 minutes later, you get a knock on the door, and you open up the door, and your senior network administrator is there saying, "Sir, our network has been compromised." And you're like, "What? What do you mean?" And he goes, "Yes, and it seems like it originated in your office." So let's go backtrack to about 6 a.m. when you were getting your phone, and you opened up your phone, and you opened up your email, and you opened up LinkedIn, and you connected with that individual. Well, that link that you got was actually malware that got downloaded onto your phone. And then when you went to that coffee shop and you checked in, you geotagged your location. This was actually a targeted spear phishing attack that ended up on your phone. Now, because you've got your location on and active, they knew that you were headed to your office. So as soon as you plug your phone into your computer, it used your phone as a command and control vehicle to move laterally into your machine and across your network. Now, while this may sound like a far-fetched scenario, it actually is something that is definitely within the realm of possibility. Because, when you think about data and the information that we are entrusted to protect within our organizations, the phrase that, has been used for quite a number of years is data is the new oil. This was actually coined by mathematician Clive Humby in 2007. And he said that data is really valuable, but if it's unrefined, it can't really be used. It has to be changed into something like gas or plastic or chemicals to create a valuable entity that drives profitable activity. So really, you have to take data, you have to break it down, you have to analyze it for it to have value. Because ultimately, data in its raw form doesn't really have a lot of value. It's really truly understanding the value of that information to make it and put it to work for you. But with that said, you have to consider the cyber consequences of the people that want access to that information. So I will go ahead and ask another question. When do you all think the first cyber attack actually occurred? Right. So when you think about that, you're thinking, probably within the last 40, maybe 50 years, right? Well, I actually would like to take you all the way back to 1862, the Civil War. So this is something that's known as the Great Locomotive Chase, where Union men actually hijacked a train in Atlanta, headed to Chattanooga, and their goal was to do as much damage as possible. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, how is that a cyber attack? Well, the Union men decided they'd go ahead and cut the telegraph wires. So the Confederates couldn't send warnings ahead of time to their forces along the railway to stop them. So this is kind of the first documented, if you will, cyber attack by cutting telegraph wires, right? So in the vein of cyber history, it's really important to know where you've been so you know where you're headed. So I'd like to actually bring to light a couple different scenarios and situations that actually occurred within the last 20 years. So you look at 1998 Moonlight Maze. This is a massive breach of classified information. It actually started 2 years prior to this, and it is attributed to a nation state. So this is one of the first widely known cyber espionage campaigns in world history, and it was first classified as kind of the first kind of APT, or advanced persistent threat, right? Fast forward to 2007, Estonia. There was a disagreement that Estonia had with Russia, which led to a massive distributed denial of service attack on Estonian infrastructure. So, really, you're now seeing nation states using cyber to do war with each other. 2008, Russia and Georgia were fighting a war. And Russia actually had a military operation that they executed, and they tied a cyber attack to their military operation. So this is kind of the first time where you're seeing cyber used as, what I would posit the fifth domain of warfare tied to physical attacks. So, and in the vein of physical attacks, this should actually have been a precursor to what actually recently happened, which I'll talk to momentarily. The 2008 Turkey pipeline. Hackers actually infiltrated the pipeline surveillance systems and the valve stations. They super pressurized the crude oil in that pipeline and caused an explosion. So this is a kind of a example of a cyber attack that turned into a physical attack. This should have actually been a prelude, and this served as a prelude to what recently happened, which I'll get to in a moment. And you had the 2011 WikiLeaks, where there was a huge release of classified information, right? So really need to understand the balance between information sharing and protection. 2012 Shamoon attack is actually quite interesting. So this was a W32 Windows NT kernel attack. So this virus infected systems. It compiled a list of files from very specific locations, uploaded them, and exfiltrated that data out to a attacker, and then erased the sourced information, and then, most importantly, it wrote the master boot record of the target system, rendering that system unusable. So what ended up happening is this particular attack actually compromised 30,000 workstations for Saudi Aramco, took the entire oil company down. They spent an entire week restoring their services. Let me tell you what they did. They actually used their aircraft and their funds to purchase most of the world's hard drives. So it drove the price of hard drives up worldwide. So you can see kind of changes in our supply chain directly impacted by events. So you can see cyber actually has quite meaningful ramifications. Saudi Aramco chose to do this because they wanted to make sure that oil prices weren't affected by speculation. So the 2013 Mandiant report, right? This report actually showed how important cyber was to nation states. So this Mandiant report was exposing China's cyber espionage group. So there was evidence that linked an advanced persistent threat to a specific China department, showing how a nation state was using cyber to compromise other nation states. And actually, if you get into near the bottom of this list, you'll see very recently how a lot of this has come to even light in a bigger way. So the 2013, you've got the Snowden leaks where you have insider threat. So not only is the threat from the outside, you have the threat from the inside. So understanding where these threats are and being able to address them is so important. And as you fast forward, banks are hit, retail is hit, cars are hit. So this is actually interesting when you're thinking about cars. In 2014, a 2014 Jeep Cherokee was actually compromised remotely, completely unaltered. So they jailbroke the Uconnect interface, exploited the dbus service, and were able to actually completely reprogram the car remotely with no changes whatsoever to the passenger vehicle itself. So this shows that, if there's a way, threat actors will find a way. And then in 2015, you see healthcare and governments attacked. You see in 2016, telecom was attacked. 2017 and 19, you see attacks across industrial control systems, our SCADA systems. Things are now scaling. And then you kind of fast forward to now in the last 2 years, 2020, one of the largest attacks that has ever been perpetrated, SolarWinds. So in March of 2020, SolarWinds pushed out a software update that included hacked code. Ended up creating a backdoor to customers' information systems, which the hackers then use to install even more tradecraft to spy on companies and organizations. And the thing is, from a supply chain perspective, SolarWinds is used in many organizations. So this showed how just the supply chain can be compromised, just by compromising one vendor. And then when you think about Colonial Pipeline, which happened just in May, ransomware shut down the pipeline carrying fuel to the eastern half of the United States. So this is classified as the largest cyber attack on an oil infrastructure target in the history of the United States. So a hacking group ended up stealing 100 gigabytes of data from these company servers the day before the malware attack, and then they threatened to release that information on the internet if they didn't pay the ransom. So Colonial ended up paying a ransom of 75 Bitcoin, so about $5 million to get the decryption key, but then found out that the decryption was going to take too long and was so slow that they ended up restoring all their systems from backup anyway. So this drove some response from the government. So this led to a presidential executive order getting signed on improving the nation's cybersecurity to increase security standards for sales to the government, tightening detection and security on existing systems, improving information sharing and training, establishing a cyber safety review board, and improving incident response. And to that end, CISA and OMB have released Zero Trust Cloud Security Technical Reference Architecture and a Zero Trust Capability Maturity Model. I chair the Cloud Security Alliance's Washington, D.C. Metro Area chapter. We're also working on a Zero Trust paper that will be released at the end of October. So I say all that to say, when you think about cyber, attacks occur in numerous ways, and there's a historical viewpoint of attacks. So, when you think about, history, Hannibal was trying to cross the Alps. The Alps were considered this impassable set of mountains, and it was considered the impassable firewall. So today's hackers have the exact same kind of stuff as the persistent Hannibal. He didn't give up until he made his way through the Alps. His famous quote to this end is, "We will find a way or we will make a way." He said this in 218 BC. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Hannibal was able to make it through and ended up changing the entire course of history of modern European civilization by being able to cross the Alps, which were previously thought impassable. But typically when you have a compromise that you think is of an impenetrable defense, the attacker leaves a mark. So scientists were actually able to go back and find the valley in which Hannibal was able to traverse the Alps, and they found it because it was actually a mass animal deposition. So they found that within the soil layers, there was a large amount of animal matter within a specific soil layer of this pass, and they realized when they dated it, they realized this is the pass that Hannibal probably used to cross the Alps. So there's usually some evidence as to when an attacker is able to compromise what you deemed was impossible. So, I think history is a powerful reminder of where we've been, so we can divine a strategy of where we're going. So, we bring history and think about it in the lens of cloud. Think about cloud through these three lenses that have been kind of denoted by NIST as infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service, these different deployment models for cloud. And when you think about what it is that you manage, right, what you manage is different in each one of these deployment models. So in an infrastructure as a service model, right, you typically are able to manage everything from the APIs up. So you manage the application that resides on top of the infrastructure as a service. And platform as a service, right, you're typically own and manage everything above your integration and middleware. And then with SaaS, well, you don't really manage a whole lot. You just consume the service. So what you own and manage as you move up the stack tends to go down. So this is something you need to consider as you're developing your cloud security strategy. So, cloud adoption in the last year specifically skyrocketed given the rise of this global pandemic. So we're seeing in large enterprises hybrid cloud and multi-cloud becoming the de facto norm, where people aren't putting everything in one place. They're leveraging the investments they already have, and they're consuming resources across a variety of different clouds, right? But as a result, you've got all this new infrastructure and applications that are being spun up, but you don't really know where it's all happening and how it's all happening. So there's a struggle to get a handle on this cloud spend. And what organizations have found is governance is the number one challenge for most organizations. And I would add to that visibility, of understanding your security and your compliance posture. So I'd like to point you to a report that was put out by the Cloud Security Alliance called the State of Cloud Security Risk, Compliance, and Misconfigurations. This is on the cloudsecurityalliance.org website, freely downloadable. But I'll kind of walk through just a couple salient points for this particular document, which is a survey of information system managers and senior leaders across a variety of different organizations. So, what they found is, that there's a high percentage of respondents that said, that when they talk about measuring security and compliance posture, there was it really varies across organizations. So, when they talked about the leading indicators that organizations use, the most selections were, the percent of unresolved high-risk misconfigurations or violations, number of failed security and compliance controls, and then the mean time to resolve misconfigurations or security and compliance violations. These are kind of the leading indicators that organizations were using to measure their security and compliance posture. So, when you think about that through the lens of how an organization's confidence in defending against a cloud security breach, very few said they were extremely confident, which is actually a good thing because organizations are inherently changing as they adopt cloud. So, but you'll see there was, quite a few that said they were moderately to very confident, right? But there's also a large percentage that said they weren't confident at all. So, and a lot of that leads back to, the tools that you have in place and the culture that you have in place to defend your cloud security breach and where you employ automation, right? So, when you think about, an organization's confidence in being able to defend against vulnerabilities and threats, most said they were moderately confident. And they were really looking at it through the lens of, mostly on compliance and regulatory risk or network risk or identity and access management risk. There's really it's network and misconfigurations are, you can see there's kind of confidence levels are pretty close, right? So that's in the sense that, really when you think about the network, you think about configurations, right? You think you're confident, but you have to have the right tools in place to make all that really work. So, one of the things I'd like to posit to this audience when you're developing your cloud security strategy is define your context. I mentioned at the onset of this conversation that data is the new oil. So, really should employ a data-centric approach where you really understand who's the user that is accessing these services. What data is this user trying to access? Where is that user? And where is the data? And how are they accessing this information, right? So think about this as something as, along the lines of context-aware IT, where the level of the assurance of the data defines the required level of trust. So I say that because you're not going to apply the same security envelope to every system that you have within your organization. Organizations have different security envelopes based on the type of data that they're trying to protect and the user accessing that information. So for example, right, if a common usage pattern is for a bank, for example, let's say you're at home and you're accessing your bank, and all of a sudden you take an overseas trip and you're accessing your bank overseas, you should probably expect to see your bank asks you for additional verification to verify your identity before they give you access to your financial information. In the same way as you're designing your cloud security strategy, apply this data-centric approach and model to really understand the trust that you're putting into the user that's accessing the information, the type of security you need to put around data. For example, if you're overseas in this example, right, and you want to access your personal email, maybe it's not as sensitive, so you don't need to have that much security around it versus obviously your financial information. So I'm just giving you some, kind of real world examples of how you would employ security, personally versus in your own organization. So, when you think of solutions that you use for cloud security, right, there's a variety of tools that are available by cloud service providers, but there's also a variety of great third-party solutions that exist today that you should certainly look at. And you can see for detecting network threats, this is one of the areas that most people relied on third-party solutions. Benchmarking and monitoring compliance and identity and access management. You may use some cloud service providers tools along with third-party or something that you build in-house. But in essence, you say all this to say you need technologies and automation for you to really develop and embrace this new paradigm we live in, which is cloud being the new normal and hybrid and multi-cloud being the new normal. So really when you think about this data-centric approach, there's three things I'd like to leave you with. Number one, understand your data. If you don't know the value of the information within your organization, I bet you money your adversary does. And they're probably finding a way to exfil that information through what you may perceive to be your impenetrable firewall. So if you identify and understand the value of the information in your organization, you can then decompose your information into fundamental building blocks where you can now look at the data and the applications that access that information and how you design your security envelope and network infrastructure to connect that information, right? And then employ your monitoring. Where now, because you know these fundamental building blocks that you've put in place for this information, right? What's your risk to the data? And then based on the risk that you have to that information, right, put in your monitoring of these systems so you can alert when an adversary is doing something or some misconfiguration, for example, comes out. Because humans are humans, and this is where you want to employ automation to automate those manual tasks that humans do around configuration, around compliance, to drive this cloud security strategy for your organization. So with that, I thank you for your time. Please do use the Q&A box to ask any questions. Otherwise, I'll turn it back to our moderator to introduce the next speaker.
Thanks so much, Anil. And now we're going to hear from Dr. Mike Lloyd, Chief Technology Officer at Red Seal. Take it away, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. That's great stuff, Anil. I really appreciate the insights about how organizations are trying to get to the context-aware IT. I think that's a great phrase, and setting up the problem with its history, and then how people are responding now. It fits into this idea of how you build a cloud security strategy. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about it from my point of view, maybe a more technical angle, but still focused very much at the strategy level. So just as you said, I want to encourage the audience members. We do have a lot of folks in the audience from a variety of different organizations. If you have any questions, please do put them into the Q&A, and we will have a few minutes at the end to be able to deal with that. So I'd encourage that. So just a brief background on me. I'm Mike Lloyd. I'm the CTO of Red Seal. Once upon a time, I was an epidemiologist back in the 1980s. One thing that's changed for us all in a pandemic world is, at least for me, I found I no longer need to explain to people what epidemiologists are for. Everybody now understands, oh, pandemics can actually get quite bad, and I guess we need some tools to be able to understand epidemiology. But for most of the last 30 years, people had no idea what I meant if I said I'd been an epidemiologist back in the 80s. But it's not what I do anymore. But what I have been doing decade by decade, you can see it all mapped out here, is taking that kind of epidemiologist's view of the world, thinking about vulnerability and spread and fragile systems, and applying that in a bunch of different domains. And back in the 1990s, I did it as network modeling, and then controlling networks. And then at Red Seal, we formed in the 10s, around about 2014, taking that idea and applying it to security. Now that's in a pre-cloud world. And now in the 2020s, we've had to transform how we do a lot of security. Cloud came along and disrupted an awful lot of cloud security stacks, a lot of the technology that we've been using. But from my point of view, over these 35 years or so of solving these kinds of problems in different areas, all about complex interacting systems that humans have a hard time thinking about, I think I've seen some common patterns. And so I want to offer those as a way to think about cloud security strategy today. There are some common themes across all these domains that still apply. whether we're in the cloud or in the earlier generations of security that we had. And I find the pandemic is actually a useful bit of framing, right? So we have to be able to think strategically as security professionals, but we also have to be able to explain what we're doing, right? We have a lot of accountability out to the rest of the business. And we find it's very, very hard to explain cybersecurity. And I think some of Anil's slides were really, really good at putting things in historic context, comparing to Hannibal, things like that. These are ideas that you can use when presenting your own security initiatives. And any kind of common language we can have with non-security professionals, other executives, is very, very helpful. And I will say, from a security point of view, the pandemic is very useful. It has these parallels, right? There are parallels between the pandemic that everybody has had to learn to think about. Everybody's had to learn new words, new ways of thinking, whether they're cyber people or not. And that can help us communicate about security and our security strategy. So, a few parallels here are fairly obvious, right? That people get viruses. We're very sensitive to that at the moment. And of course, we've been talking about threats in the computer environment as viruses since about the mid-'80s in some of the earlier parts of Anil's history slides, right? In the earliest days, we thought of the security risks as being just like viruses. So we had that insight very early on. But things evolve, right? The nature of diseases that humans face clearly evolve. Indeed, even the one virus going around at the moment, we're watching it evolve around the globe in real time. And computer threats have evolved too, right? They've changed a lot since the early days of the Morris worm, or going even further back, the great train chase, right? I think that was a great point about the Civil War. And we're watching that evolution occur, but animals have had a way to deal with that, where biology has developed immune systems, right? So animals, biological systems, are very, very good at combating viruses and other kinds of threats by having things like memory T cells that we've had to learn some things about. And in a world where you can develop a vaccine, right? These are all triggering things in animals' immune systems, and computer networks really still don't have that. So the red box in the bottom right is sort of my statement about where the security industry is at the moment. It's certainly part of what motivates me in the work that I do at Red Seal, but I think a lot of security professionals are trying to figure out how to develop something like an immune system for networks. It's a challenging, high-level strategic problem. We're still working on it, but I think we've made some progress, and you can apply that practically in your environments if you can adapt some of the epidemic thinking and some of the epidemic language for talking to people about your security programs. So let's talk in just a little bit more detail about the pandemic, right? Again, very commonly understood terms now. The big lessons for the pandemic that everybody's had to learn are that social distancing matters, right? Separating people slows down disease spread. Okay, very clear. Everybody, even small children now understand that there's this thing called social distancing. That's an important new idea that people didn't have in 2019, but they have it now, and we can use that when we communicate about cybersecurity. There's contact tracing, the idea that, okay, if you've found that somebody's infected, you need to know who they've had contact with and where the disease can spread from there. Very important point of fighting a disease. And also, let's not miss the huge role since the beginning of this pandemic of basic hygiene, right? The most important advice they could give us when this whole thing started 18 months ago was wash your hands and wear a mask, right? It's really, really basic. And these principles apply very, very well to cybersecurity programs. You can think about how much are you doing in these three areas. You can use this to describe what you're doing to executives outside the security business. When you need to summarize your strategy, you can describe it using this kind of framing. Because in a little more detail, well, what's social distancing for your network? Well, we have a term for that. It's called segmentation. And we've had our evolution of terminology, just like we do in this business, where micro-segmentation, pico-segmentation, all this kind of stuff. But it's also, and if you talk that way to non-security professionals, they don't know what any of that technical stuff means, but they do understand social distancing. So it's important to think about how social distancing for your network can be useful. It's a reason that you can bring up when talking about why you need more control, more separation, more visibility, so you can slow down the spread of attacks when they land. There's a problem, though, in businesses, which is all of the businesses that we work for are trying to innovate and do new things, right? That, to be healthy in business is to be changing. But that innovation means new connections and new infection pathways are always coming along. and it's really tough for security controls to catch up. So it's really difficult to take the idea of social distancing for a network and then enforce controls without harming the business. You have to learn a strategy for doing it flexibly, right? You have to figure out, okay, what are the kinds of segmentation, the kinds of social distancing in the network that we have to maintain, and then what can we allow to be flexible? Because if we are just Dr. No in the security department, nobody's going to listen to us. Nobody's going to take our strategy seriously. So we have to have a flexible definition of social distancing. We also need some way to deal with contact tracing, right? Because we all know that cyber attacks move laterally, right? Just like Anil's intro story, right? It starts out with somebody waking up and using their phone and getting into a coffee shop and getting spearphished. And then what happens? They come into the office and the attack is detected because it spreads. And spread is a core idea in epidemics, but it's often overlooked in cybersecurity strategies, right? I see far too many organizations whose cloud security strategy or hybrid network security strategies, I will just make checklists. I'll make long checklists and make sure that every element is configured correctly, and then I'll be fine. And this is not the way we combat real epidemics, right? We have to deal with contact tracing because we know real diseases are going to spread. And likewise, like in Anil's story, right? The problem was not that the phone had some malware on it, it's that the malware came into the network and then it spread. But spread is very tough for humans to think about. That's what I've learned in 35 years of modeling epidemics themselves, then modeling networks, and now modeling security in networks, is humans have a hard time understanding spread in IT networks. And so we need to put some energy and focus there. And then there's still the point of basic hygiene, right? So of course, as security professionals, we often end up nagging people for a living. We sound like dentists reminding people that they have to floss. And no matter how many times they say it, dentists have they have to keep saying it because the message somehow doesn't always get through. And we have a lot of challenges in that area just because, say, Cloud Fabric moves so fast and changes so fast. There's so much of it that because of that rapid rate of change, mistakes creep in, right? All humans have an error rate, even those of us in security who try to do the best job we can. We all make mistakes. And then we try and clean up. And Anil had some stats about how people monitor for how they clean up and how much confidence they have in those monitoring mechanisms. The problem with a lot of those mechanisms is most organizations run out of willpower to really eradicate all the problems, right? It's not like we don't know how to make secure Cloud Fabric or secure on-prem or secure hybrid networks. It's that most organizations run out of willpower once they've got it about 95% done. Because most things in business you can do to about, 95% done and that's good enough. But of course, in cybersecurity, you can't do that. You know that if you only have 95% coverage, then the bad guys, either through skill or through simple evolution, will hide in the 5% that you're not dealing with. Right? You know that your problems will concentrate down into the areas of the network that you can't see or the issues you didn't fix. And so the 95% is good enough idea just does not work in security. But it's really hard to do anything 100%, right? It's very hard to do anything consistently at scale and do it well. So this is why there's so much focus in the security industry at the moment in automation. And Anil brought that up. Certainly at Red Seal, we try to help people achieve a lot more automation of how they do these 3 points, right? How they figure out social distancing in the network, how they can figure out how attacks will spread in their network, and then how they can still deal with the basic hygiene, because that problem never goes away, right? Even if I say checklists are not enough, you still do need hygiene checklists. You still need to make sure that things are fundamentally set up correctly. So again, looking at other fields, any other field that I've seen that deals in the stuff that we deal with, these complex interacting systems that are very hard for humans to think about, they have one thing in common. All of those fields, that could be weather, could be epidemics, could be crash testing of cars, could be figuring out road traffic, all these complex interacting systems, they all depend on modeling. That's how academics approach these complicated problems. It's how civil engineers and mechanical engineers understand whether a tower block is going to fall down or not, right? They build models. In the case of earthquakes, perhaps the most extreme physical example, but a very good analogy for security, is if we want to understand whether a house is going to fall down in an earthquake. I'm sitting here in California as I speak, so it's a pressing topic out here. You know, we don't just ask, did I make the house out of good materials? Right? This is, if you imagine a house made of perfect bricks, is that house immune to falling down? Of course it isn't. Right? You can check every element in a house, every brick that it's made of, but that's not asking the system level question of, is it assembled well? And this is what we need to add to our cloud security strategies. We need an element level of thinking where, well, taking the cue from the picture on the left, we need to be able to build a model of our IT fabric and then shake it and see where it fails. Specifically, what I mean here is do attack simulation. And I'm hardly the only one in the industry talking about this. There's a whole field now of breach and attack simulation and attack surface minimization. And all of these are doing the same thing that you see the civil engineers in the picture on the left doing, right? Trying to look at the system as a whole and shake it to see where its defects are, to see where it fails, so that you can shore up those defenses. And that's an important piece that is often missing from people's security strategy. Right? There can be too much focus on, I need to make sure every brick is perfect, and it misses the system level thinking. Or I like to illustrate for this, context-aware IT. You have to be able to put everything together in a model so that you can have context of what it is that you're thinking about. If you found a vulnerability on a system, well, so what? It matters what context it's in. It matters where it is. Like in this building, is it on the corner or is it on an inside non-load-bearing wall? The same vulnerability in the fabric of the building has completely different meaning depending on whether it's in a load-bearing corner or just an interior partition wall. And we have to be able to answer those kinds of questions, but it's not that easy. So we need a way to do this, but it does face some technical challenges. Now, these are the technical challenges that I work on every day at Red Seal, because we have to help organizations pull together that shaking table model of their environment so they can do what Anil was calling context-aware IT. But it's challenging because cloud is so diverse. Right? There are so many cloud vendors, and if your organization is of any size, you have probably failed, if you tried, to enforce a single standard of how cloud is done. Right? The thing with cloud is it's got all these wonderful benefits about innovation and speed and dynamism. It's really changing a lot. But this means every VP with a credit card at your company can go out and buy their choice of cloud vendor. And every one of these cloud vendors does it differently. They all have the idea of, oh yeah, I'll build you some compute in the cloud and I'll give you a virtual network in the cloud. But they do it in different ways. They have different lingo from each vendor. They have different cloud controls. And so it's a dizzying array of different languages that you have to speak. And I doubt I'm having to break any news to anybody here, but it's kind of tough to hire these days, right? It's tough to hire security professionals who can speak all of these languages fluently, who understand Kubernetes and Azure and Google Cloud and on-prem networking, because that stuff hasn't gone away. And all of this stuff has this characteristic that I talk about from epidemiology of too many interactions. There's too many ways now as the innovation proceeds, where we have things like VPC transit peering, right? Complicated technical mumbo jumbo, perhaps, if you're not living in the cloud world. But slowly, cloud networks are evolving to be every bit as complicated and every bit as feature-rich as on-prem networks got to be in the last 30 years. But this means cloud networks are inherently very, very complicated, and it rapidly outstrips human scale, right? It's far too hard for humans to get their arms around this and understand all the details. So you need automation. So Anil and I come at that this problem from different angles and different backgrounds. Him from the NNSA and me from epidemiology. But we both see the same core need to understand details and put it in context of your environment using automation. There simply isn't a way to hire enough people to understand all the vendors and the interactions and all the complexity of this cloud fabric. So to wrap that up, cloud is complex and changing, right? Amazon has an awful lot of coders building new features. So does Google. These people are moving cloud technology forward at a great rate, and your organizations, whether you want them to or not, are adopting it because there are some good financial rewards for doing so. And it's handy that in some ways cloud is different because it does eliminate some old problems in network fabric, but unfortunately it substitutes them for new problems. So cloud adds brand new ways to get things wrong. Before we got to cloud, nobody was talking about, oh, do I have any of my data in a world-readable S3 bucket, right? That's an example of a new problem that is really pervasive and was caused by moving to cloud. So you have to be able to understand whether or not you have data in a world-readable S3 bucket, and that's new. We didn't have to ask that question 5, 10 years ago. And to do that, you're not going to be able to get enough human professionals to understand all of these languages, and that means we're going to need some degree of automated modeling. Now, if I try to boil all of that down into one key point, going back to the pandemic one more time, what the pandemic caused us all to do as people in our daily lives, thinking about our children and going to school or taking a flight to go and see family members, right? We have to think about, now, how exposed am I when I do that? And that core idea, what is exposed, that perhaps is the one key thing that I would boil down out of my theme here, to say, if you can look at your environment, if you can see it all and understand what is exposed and what is not, this is the real goal of your cloud security program. It's not to go and make checklists and do all the right CIS guidance and hardening. That's all good stuff, right? In fact, I offer that as part of my product. But it's not that it has no value. It's that it's not a complete strategy. A complete strategy is focused on, can I or can I not answer the question of what is exposed in my cloud fabric? Most organizations still struggle to answer that, and that is where we need to focus our strategic efforts. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Q&A. I think we have had a couple of questions come in, but I'd like to invite the audience to ask any more.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation, a lot to think about there. And yes, audience, please type your questions into the Q&A box. We will be taking those in a minute. Before we start with the Q&A, though, please direct your attention to our webinar survey available on the bottom of the presentation window. And thanks in advance for filling it out. Your filling out of this feedback form and participation in this survey lets us serve you better for future webinars. So thanks again to our speakers, and I want to start with the question and answer portion of our event. As a reminder, to participate, just type your question into the text box located to the right of the presentation window, or click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If we aren't able to answer all the submitted questions during today's webinar, we'll be sure to share them with our speakers who can reply to you offline. But I wanted to start out with sort of an interesting question going to Mike's presentation, comparing security to the pandemic. And this question comes in from a listener who's asking, we're seeing people who are resisting some of the measures that public health has taken to help make it better, masking and vaccines, but there's even a bigger question when it comes to security in the networks, as far as getting users to comply with setting up proper strategy for security and resistance to proper strategy for security. And this person is wondering if you could share your experience and advice on how to work with organizations on setting up the proper strategy and getting past that resistance.
Right.
Do you want to take that, Mike?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's quite perceptive about organizational politics or organizational dynamics. I certainly don't want to get into the broader way that the pandemic has become politicized in public life. That's a different topic. But the parallel of that to the internal politics of organizations is really an excellent point. And I do see organizations struggling with that. I will say I'm optimistic to one degree, because I find most people in an organization have learned from media reports and so on that cybersecurity is a big deal, right? When I started doing security specific about 15 years ago, I literally met people who would say things like, in my organization, we make healthcare devices. We help people survive medical emergencies. Why would anybody attack us? And I don't hear that anymore. So that's a point of optimism. Nobody feels invulnerable anymore, because people have realized the bad guys are out there and they really do attack SCADA systems. They really do attack medical systems. So I find that perceptions outside the security field about the importance of our security advice has improved a lot in the last 15 years. But it's not all rosy. Perhaps the most challenging thing I still see that's bedeviled the security industry for a long time is the false positive problem. And this gets particularly bad in cloud, right? So within security, I think everybody listening to this knows that when you use security technologies, you get a lot of false positives about security issues that aren't really all that big a deal. And we know we have to filter those out. But what I found is particularly challenging in cloud is Cloud Fabric is changing a lot. It's managed by experts. Who, most organizations have one or two really great cloud gurus, and they're not in the security team. So if you're in the security team and you think you found something wrong with the Cloud Fabric, and you go to those people and your finding is incorrect, well, that's a problem. That's a big problem. They lose respect for the security people very, very quickly. And unfortunately, I've seen that dynamic work in quite a few different organizations. There isn't really a magic answer for it so much as you have to be very confident. And Anil's survey, and Anil, you may have an angle on this as well. You talked about confidence in security controls and in technologies. You have to be very rigorous about cloud findings, especially, because I find if you're not confident that your result is true and you take it to the networking team who are not security specialists, or especially the cloud team, you can get laughed out of court, and you can lose the next time you come back as well. So it's very, very important to make sure your results are reliable before you go and tug the shirt sleeves of the cloud people and say, hey, I think you set your cloud up wrong. I've seen that go badly, unfortunately, several times.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And now I have a question. I think this one's for you, Anil. What are the top 2 or 3 things we should focus on when devising our own cloud security strategy?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jessica. And Mike, really appreciate your insight on this particular topic and tying it to your background in epidemiology. Very fascinating. As you're thinking through your own cloud security strategy, right? 2 things. 1, visibility, because you can't protect what you can't see. And 2, automation. Humans make mistakes. And employing automation in areas that are repeatable will save you time, will save you money, and will allow you to focus your efforts on more value-added activities that humans are really good at, which is once you know what your problems are, you've employed automation to remediate those things or find them in the first place. You can then leverage the human component, which is good at understanding what your risk is and where you should accept risk and where you should employ additional capabilities to secure your environment. So that would be the first 2 things I would invest in is indeed in visibility and in automation. And when you talk about automation, it's for both security and compliance. So I say it through both of those lenses because there's a compliance aspect that is so important that heavily regulated organizations are beholden to. And those compliance obligations are increasing, at a rate that is directly proportional to the level of attacks that are coming in, the changes that we're seeing in our organizations. Yet there's a lot of challenges in meeting those compliance obligations on a continuous basis. So employing visibility and automation for both security and compliance is an area that I would highly encourage attendees to focus your time on when you're devising your own strategy.
Amen. I'd comment on the same lines. I think there's a risk we may have achieved violent agreement on this point. Information are really absolutely essential. Of course, in cloud, you lose visibility very quickly, right? The cloud's wonderful and very powerful and very flexible, but it's not very visual. And that's a problem. Humans are frequently visual thinkers, especially high-level decision makers. They like visuals. It's really hard to make good visuals of the cloud. I do it all day, but I respect how difficult it is. So visibility is really key, and then automation as well. If I can make a quick analogy, there's an interesting comparison here when we think about the automation, about what the automation is for. You made the point, Anil, about what humans are good at and what computers are good at. And I agree. Our talk here is about strategy. Humans are great at strategy, and we're terrible at details. We get tired too quickly. We're useless at reading phone books. Computers can read phone books and find mistakes in them, but they have no idea of the strategy of the game. They don't know how to play poker well, right? So humans are indeed fantastic at strategy, really weak on details. And so the role of automation is to divide up the work, right? Your strategy should be to divide the work between the humans and the computers. You can't have computers do everything. I see a lot of hype and hope wrapped around, oh, if we just apply enough AI, all these problems will go away. No, they won't. Computers will never really understand the purpose of a business or your strategic objectives. But you can marry together humans with computers in very effective teams where you have the humans focus on what you said, Anil, on what they're good at. There's a comparable field, in fact, in chess. So chess is a game of complex interactions, just like cloud networking. And in chess, we found that computers are inexhaustible at checking details about your position on a chessboard, but humans are still better at strategy. And so what we find is human-computer teams play better chess. And there's a whole field called advanced chess or centaurs, depending on who you read, that deals with this. That says, it's a very, very interesting way of dividing up the labor. And I think that's the future for security, is to focus the humans on the high-level strategic themes we've been talking about, and then have machines check both brick-by-brick details and then the shaking table that I talked about, right? It's stepping it up a level and saying, now as a system, let's check whether the whole system is going to survive an attack or not. Very much the way a chess computer thinks about your defenses.
Well said.
Nice analogy there. That answers another question that we had, which is, the best places to employ automation. And that's a huge topic right now. But since we touched on that already, I also wanted to ask you, in terms of the term context-aware IT, it sounds great, but how does an organization connect it to their goal, to the organization's IT spaghetti? How do you align those things?
Do you want to take first answer on that, or Neil? I certainly can comment on it.
Yeah. No, I'll take a first stab at that. So, really, when you think about context-aware IT, it goes to what Mike was saying, is focusing on what the human is good at. The human is primarily focused on the organization's goals, right? So, and only a human can do that. A computer can't do that. So, it's going to take a human to devise and understand and define the organization's goals. IT's job is to support that. To enable IT to move at the speed of business, you first need to take that time to understand what those goals are, to then take your technology infrastructure and ensure it's aligned to the organization's goals, whatever they might be, and then devise your security and your risk envelope so that you employ automation and visibility where it makes the most sense, and you're bringing the right information to decision makers to understand what your risk tolerance is, understand what your decisions need to be made, and make those decisions leveraging the context in which those decisions need to be made, right? So that's really kind of, starting at the top of what's your goal that you're trying to accomplish, aligning IT to support that goal, employing visibility and automation around both the security and compliance of that information in a real-time, continuous, and complete manner, so the information that you're bringing is correct to the decision makers for them to make well-informed decisions and allow IT to move at the speed of business.
Well, that's great. I know we're on borrowed time now. We're down to I'll keep comment very, very short. But yeah, it's like we're drilling a tunnel from two ends. I completely agree, Anil. When you're drilling down from the business side, you need to summarize in the ways that you're talking about technology side and try and meet you in the middle. One bit of optimism, a very brief point on optimism in cloud, is there are these wonderful new things called tags or labels, depending on which vendor you talk about. Because when you try and build up from the technology to complement what Anil is talking about coming down for the business objectives, and you try and make these two meet in the middle, which is what we try and do, just like in real estate where it's location, 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 in technical security work, it's inventory, inventory, inventory. First, you have to gather your inventory, and then you have to figure out what it's for so that you can do the mapping that Anil is talking about. And you get a wonderful new thing in cloud that we never got on legacy networks, which is you get these labels left on things that give you hints, no magic decoder ring, unfortunately, but they give you hints on who built this and why. What's it for? And we always struggled with that in legacy networks, and that problem did get easier. So I do think cloud, even though I've said some negative things about it, brings some positive new ways to be able to come at this problem upwards from the technology, the end I tend to come from, so that we can meet in the middle with Anil coming down from business objectives and marry the two together. Don't overlook the magic new world of tags as a way to do that. Maybe with that, we're out of time.
That's great. And that you're right. That is all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank you both. Thanks, Anil and Mike. Information Week certainly appreciates your time and expertise on today's topic. And I want to send a special thank you out to our sponsor, Red Seal, as well as to everyone in the audience today. We appreciate your attention and participation. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been available to listen to the event. This webinar is copyright by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Information Week and Red Seal, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guests, Red Seal, I'm Jessica Davis. Thanks so much for your time and have a great day.